tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to bring this out of the personal realm and into the political realm here for a moment. Michael Cooper is a Conservative member of Parliament and joins me now. Michael, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
With you, Andrew.
Now, you're obviously on this committee, the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, and I stressed this with my audience a moment ago, but I think it bears repeating here. The government has not shown any desire to walk this back. They're talking about this as a matter of when and not if, correct?
That was the message of both the Health Minister and the Justice Minister, Mark Holland and reevaluate, when they had a press conference the other day. And that anything short of an indefinite pause, in our view, would be unacceptable because there are fundamental problems with expanding MAiD in cases where mental illness is the sole underlying disorder or condition.
Yeah, and I've shared my own struggles and story with my listeners in the past. As a survivor of suicide, I have grave concerns about the implications of this for people that are going through now and in the future what I went through in the past. But one of the things I find so shocking about this is that even before this change has come into effect, we have heard so many stories of people that are not eligible under the current laws that are still finding their way through the system. So I think already there's a problem here that the government has not shown an eagerness or even interest in dealing with.
Absolutely. And we've seen many instances of abuse and persons who are vulnerable, who have been pressured or coerced into getting MAiD. And with respect to MAiD and mental illness, this fundamentally changes the concept of MAiD. When the original MAiD legislation was passed in 2016, Bill C-14, it was sold as something that was tied to someone dying, medical assistance in dying, for persons who had the capacity and who were suffering to make the choice to end their life just a little bit sooner. This radically changes that into something that would be tantamount to state-sanctioned, state-facilitated suicide, impacting some of the most vulnerable persons in Canadian society.
Now, you're obviously, in addition to being an MP, a lawyer by training, so I think you can probably weigh in on this better than some of your colleagues can. But the government has effectively said its hands are tied on this, that the Supreme Court made a ruling that said the previous regime, which is, I guess, the current regime, was too restrictive, and they've kind of been forced into that. So what's your perspective on that aspect of this?
It's simply nonsense. The Carter decision did not pronounce on MAiD and mental illness. This is beyond the parameters of the Carter decision. There has been a law since 2016, and there has not been a single court decision that has struck down the law from the standpoint of restricting MAiD and mental illness. This was a purely political decision made by the Liberals in, frankly, a shambolic and reckless fashion. It is what happens when a government, and this is a government that has put blind ideology ahead of evidence-based decision-making. This expansion of MAiD occurred as a result of a Senate amendment that David Lametti, as Justice Minister, accepted at the last minute. The Liberals proceeded to shut down debate, ram this expansion through with an arbitrary timeline of 2 years, and then said, let's study the issue after the fact. And what experts have said, loud and clear to the Liberals, is that this is not safe, this is not appropriate, and it will result in persons who could get better to have their lives prematurely ended.
Well, you're right to point out there, Michael, the problem with the process here, because originally, people may recall, this was meant to have come in automatically after a 2-year phase-in period. And the government just said, oh, yeah, we'll figure out the details in that 2 years. And they didn't. I mean, there was no agreement reached. There was no resolution to this. Now, thankfully, they at least delayed it to prevent that initial implementation. And here we are again with yet another delay or pause, as they put it. But they were, in a lot of ways, going to just let this sneak in.
That's right. And what happened is just before the phase-in, which was scheduled for March of 2023, March of last year, 17 chairs of psychiatry representing the chairs of psychiatry at all medical schools in Canada penned a letter calling on the Liberals to put a pause on this expansion. And they identified fundamental problems with this. And it was only then that the Liberals introduced legislation at the last minute last year to put a 1-year pause on this expansion of MAiD. 1 year later, we find ourselves in exactly the same position. At literally the same time this year is last, with a deadline of March, the Liberals are bringing in rush legislation to put a further pause because the very issues that were identified as problematic with this expansion remain the same today. And it's why this government, I would submit, just again, if they do the responsible thing, should just recognize they got it wrong. They made a mistake to go down this road in the first place and put a permanent pause on this. Trying to kick the can 1 or 2 or 3 years down the road isn't going to change the fundamental problems that exist with this.
I mean no disrespect when I say this, Michael, to your chosen profession in politics here, but a lot of what is done in the House of Commons and through legislation, it has meaning and it has significance, but it's not life or death. This is literally, I mean, by design, by definition, life or death legislation. And, I can just use my own example because it's one I know intimately, but other people have come to me when I've talked about this in the past with their own stories who've literally said, I was at a time in my life, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where if this were available to me, I would have taken it and I would be dead. And then you fast forward and life has turned around. So the government has not, that I have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong because you were on the committee, proposed a legitimate and useful guardrail or protective measure to ensure that people who are in situations like I was in and like other people have been in will not access this. I mean, even yesterday, Minister Holland, I felt, was gaslighting when he talked about, people who have suffered for decades and tried everything. Even if that were the test, I've not seen that spelled out anywhere in writing, that you have to have been going through something for decades and you have to have exhausted all avenues. So that's not even a guardrail they've proposed, is it?
Not a guardrail. Advocates of it claim that that's what would happen, but then they oppose legislating it. In fact, the government provided no safeguards, no new safeguards. And quite frankly, there aren't any safeguards that would make this expansion safe because there are two fundamental clinical and legal issues. The first is a clinical and legal one, and that is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to predict irremediability. In other words, it's difficult, if not impossible, to predict whether someone could get better, resulting in persons prematurely having their lives ended, which is completely unacceptable. We heard evidence from psychiatrists that a mistake or error rate could be as high as 50% of the time on the question of irremediability. And it's a legal 50%. 50%.
So we're talking about a coin toss here, basically.
A coin toss. Another psychiatrist said they could be right not 5% of the time or 95% of the time. There's just so much uncertainty surrounding it, which just underscores the recklessness of this, because if the Liberals had studied this, had they consulted before deciding to do this, they would have heard that feedback from leading psychiatrists. And I would hope that no responsible government would, on that basis, move ahead with this. But this doesn't appear to be a responsible government. And the second issue that is a clinical one, fundamental, is that it is difficult to accurately assess when persons are suffering from mental illness, whether their request for MAiD is one that is rational, in other words, that they're competent to make that request, or whether it is one motivated by suicidal ideation. That's underscored by the fact that in about 90% of cases of suicide deaths, those persons have a diagnosable mental illness.
Yeah, and there, I mean, just to put a fine point on that, the request itself could be a symptom, which, under current healthcare protocols, a doctor would have to respond with a mechanism to make sure you're safe, instead of, facilitating this, instead of giving you a pamphlet or a referral to someone that can make that happen, which is why this is just so incredibly disgusting. And, there were questions that Minister Holland was facing from reporters who I thought were quite good on this, generally saying, you're going to make this a political issue by delaying it closer to an election. I don't think, and maybe I'm just overly positive or optimistic here, I don't think this being an election issue helps the Liberals. I have to think that Canadians are as repulsed by this as you and I are. And I'm wondering if you've got any insight on that in terms of letters you've received or people that have testified before the committee.
Well, the overwhelming evidence before the committee from experts, in fact, just about every leading expert said, don't go ahead with this. There were nearly 900 briefs submitted in the span of about a week, which is very high for a committee. In fact, it might be the most briefs I've had on a committee or a study that I've been involved in, which shows public interest and concern. And most of those briefs submitted by Canadians, including a number of experts, was don't go ahead with this. And although they like to talk about this in an abstract sense, let's talk about what this would really mean. Who would qualify? What does it mean to expand MAiD in cases of mental illness? When Mona Gupta, who was the chair of the Liberal-appointed expert panel on this matter, was asked what would constitute a mental illness or a mental disorder, she said anything listed in the DSM-5. What that would mean is that it could include persons who are suffering from depression, who have schizophrenia, who are autistic, who have issues arising from drug addictions. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about MAiD and mental illness. Instead of offering persons hope and help who are struggling, what this Liberal government is doing with this expansion is offering them death. And I think that's so fundamentally wrong. And I think most Canadians would be repulsed by it. Yeah. And the more Canadians learn about it, they are.
Yeah, and also as psychiatrists have testified and said, diagnostic criteria are not always simple on these things. There's a lot of overlap. It's not like you can do a blood test for depression. It's not like you can just in a 100% certain way even diagnose someone with this. How do you know this is just mental illness and not just a phase in life that's brought on by circumstances? So absolutely ghastly. I'm glad there is some pushback on this. Michael Cooper, Conservative Democratic Reform critic. Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.